All right, good afternoon, class. We'll get down to brass tacks here. I'm just following up on a conversation that we began in class today, talking really um, our core focus was this notion of Asian values, what's meant by the term, and how do they apply to our current issue that we're exploring with our final Unit 5, which is the evolving relationship between the United States and China, which I think is probably going to be one of the most important developments of an international character here in the 21st century. So these are the objectives or questions that we're concerning ourselves with today. And most of you were in class today, and you know we watched a 10-minute clip on the story of human rights, which was a very quick overview of essentially Western civilization, Western societies, and their crafting over a period of a couple millennia, actually, this notion of a set of universal human rights. And it's useful to understand how that became a product of Western civilization, because our purpose today is to look at this countervailing set of values that we might call Asian values, and we'll see that they bear some contrast to Western notions of human rights. Talked about these things in class about after the Cold War, the West, and particularly the United States, had this seemingly unchecked power, economic, military, cultural influence really over the world order. And this raised, among other things, some competing voices and competing ideas that began to catch hold, particularly in East Asia, at a time when many East Asian nations were regaining their stride and momentum from an economic platform, and were taking steps to essentially show their strength, largely economic strength, in the overall world order. So we're finishing up today. We're talking about this notion of othering, and that's something that we explored a little bit earlier in our quarter together when we were talking in Unit 2 about we were exploring sort of the nature of violence and how terrorism seems to be a form of violence that is largely tied to the Muslim world. Although we took a little time then to notice that Europeans were creating a sort of different picture of Eastern nations and Eastern civilizations, going back to the European imperial era. And interestingly enough, many countries in the Muslim world, and then also beyond that to other parts of the Eastern world, were depicted as being somewhat passive and somewhat subservient and lacking in vigor and so on and so forth. And so that was a form of othering that Europe carried out. But Asian values is in some ways a reversal of that, because it's a form of othering that involves looking at the West and noting differences, cultural differences that Westerners, Europeans and Americans have in contrast to East Asians. And so at the root of this is this notion that in the East, what is valued is one's relationship as part of a larger collective or a larger community. And so things like consensus or agreement, unity of purpose, harmony and balance, and then community are ultimately what matters. And individuals oftentimes subvert their individual interest for the benefit of these larger collective social concerns. In contrast, according to Eastern or Asian value advocates, there's a criticism there of the West, that the West is too caught up in pluralism, meaning people can think differently and express themselves differently. They can come together in conflict over their ideas and their differing visions of the future. This creates something of a disunity, and it's all built around individuals, because in the West, as this theory goes, individualism is what's valued among almost anything else, and therefore this obsession with the individual and individual rights, if you stop to think about that, the concept of human rights is very tied to rights that individuals have, not rights that societies have, but rights that individuals have. And from an East Asian perspective, at least under these Asian values, that is something to not necessarily be celebrated. In fact, it's a source of problems. So that's where we left off. Here's a brief statement by one of the leading sort of advocates or proponents of Asian values. This is a former Prime Minister of Malaysia, a gentleman by the name of Mahathir Mohamad. And he famously said, "Many Western societies are morally decadent. Hence, East Asian societies can provide an alternative development and political model that may supplant those of the faltering West." And you'll understand in that comment there's a certain assumption of Western failure and Western decline. And this was a statement made in the 1990s, and of course remains to be seen whether there is an element of accurate prophecy here. But this gives you a little glimpse of how there are many, and particularly politically powerful leaders, and we'll talk about that in a moment, why Asian values might be attractive to political leaders in East Asia. But many political leaders who criticize Western ideas, values, a Western concept of human rights as being a form of cultural imperialism. The West putting and placing upon others its personal values, as if it is unduly stepping on the rights and sovereignty of other countries in the world beyond the West. So, the essence of Asian values, here are some things. Human rights are not universal, neither can they be globalized. This is essentially the idea of cultural relativism, right? That in different regions of the world, where people emerge from different historical circumstances, different religious circumstances, different social circumstances, heck, different environmental circumstances, that it just stands to reason that people might come up with different values and different notions about what rights people might be guaranteed or have guaranteed for them. And so this is one of the first of four important aspects of Asian values. Pardon me. Second, there's also this suggestion by advocates of Asian values that Asian societies are centered on the family. Sometimes folks tie this to, as Amartya Sen talks about a little bit in your reading for today, this notion of Confucianism. Confucianism is a very family-oriented, I'll call it a political philosophy or social philosophy, that individuals within a society need to have a clear understanding of their relationships with others. They need to pay proper respect and homage to those members of society who are naturally in a place of greater power or influence than them. So this notion of a family, sometimes this has given attention to the notion that in East Asia, sometimes these nations are parent states, meaning the leader, the prime minister of an East Asian state is that of a father who is not only disciplining his children, but he is deciding for his children. He is protecting his children from foreign influences, perhaps much as a parent would protect his or her son or daughter from harmful media messages, inappropriate movies, foul language, so on and so forth. There's this notion in East Asian societies that individuals need to be protected, and they're protected by the state, that people in East Asian societies don't necessarily have a fear or distrust of state power. In fact, they count on it as being a source of positive change for them. And so the interests of family and nation follow from this model that people, first and foremost, fall in line as members of a family and members of a nation, and that those duties and being subject to those forces, being a member of a family ruled by a father, member of a nation ruled by a prime minister, is in fact fitting. There's also, in this Asian values essence, this notion that economic rights are more important than political rights. So if the state can steer a proper course of economic policy such that all of the people are employed, all of the people are fed, all of the people are having their basic needs met, then that's ultimately more important. You know, make sure you're putting food in the bellies of the people, and then they won't necessarily complain about maybe not having free rights of expression or free rights to complain when they might feel that things aren't going right. So this is a little foreign again to people in the West, where political rights are absolutely elevated and held as something close to sacred. Okay, and then finally, a final essence of Asian values, the right of a nation's self-determination. So China or Vietnam or Taiwan or Singapore, the idea here is that they be, as part of their sovereignty, as part of their power as a independent state, it is for them to determine whether, for them to determine what human rights the people of their nation enjoy, right? That's not something that some foreign country or some foreign, even international entity like the United Nations should get to determine for them. That's something that should be determined by the nation itself. Again, this whole cultural relativism, it shouldn't be one size or one policy fits all. It should be that different and unique nations in the world can independently arrive at what they think are the proper rights that all members of their society enjoy. And so that is sort of, in essence, where we get to with this notion of East Asian values. So advocates of Asian values are distrustful of Western human rights as a form of cultural imperialism. The West, once again, telling the rest of the world how it should behave and what it should do. They also think that, well, looking at it from the other side, critics from the West who criticize this notion of Asian values oftentimes think that Asian values are put forth by political leaders in East Asia as essentially a cover, as a way for those political leaders to have more power. Because if you think of it as if it's the state that matters, and it's the nation that matters, and it's the family that matters more to individuals in East Asia, this creates the circumstances or the conditions whereby a powerful political leader can secure more power for himself, right? Because the people are learning not to question the state and the state's policies or the state's officials. And so that is oftentimes the counter criticism. In your reading for today, we heard the questions from Amartya Sen. I hope you can revisit those. Look at the questions that were assigned with the reading for our time together today. What do you think Amartya Sen thinks about this notion of Asian values, if you had to put in words for him? And then also, which side of the rift do you fall on? We'll start class tomorrow talking a little bit about these two things. Like, what do you think? Are the East Asian values, are they more compelling? Are you more kind of firmly in the camp of the West and this notion of universal human rights? How universal should values and rights, how universally should those be defined? Okay, and with that, I'll just leave you with the questions. This is a review, because most you saw this in my announcement over break. But these are the questions that might help you answer Amartya Sen's take on things. All right, thanks, and we'll see you tomorrow.